To the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all, everyone, to the 7 Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up our glasses, pull up a chair, and gather together here in our very favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub. Joining me, as always, Mr. James Waldo and Jason Pintrail. I am Micah Hanks, and greetings, fellas. Been a while since we got behind the mic together.
Yeah, it's been quite a while. We've had a lot going on. We've been out on the road a lot, been on some cool projects. It's pretty exciting, but I'm glad to be back on the microphone.
Yeah, it's absolutely great to be back. Like you said, James, lots of things keeping us busy. 3 different hosts doing 3 different things all at once. But here we are on a beautiful Saturday morning and ready to dive into this next episode.
Heck, speak for yourself. I'm one host who I feel like I'm doing everything all at once, all by myself. That's what happens this time of the year, though. I've got to tell you guys, there's this interesting documentary on Netflix about the Osho cult, Wild, Wild Country. Have you guys seen this yet?
I watched the first episode of that last night. How funny that you should mention that. One of my coworkers had said, "Hey, have you seen this documentary on Netflix?" I'm like, "Nah, I don't think so. Never heard of it." So I watched it last night, and it's really very, very interesting.
It is. Yeah, I got through the first episode last night, too. So once again, synchronicity. This has happened with Jason and I before, too, where we both sat down one night, independent of each other, hadn't talked about it, but we were going to watch The Lost City of Z on Amazon, and it was so boring that it put us both to sleep, I think, Jason.
Oh, yeah, that was brutal. However, I haven't seen this documentary, so what exactly are we talking about, guys?
Well, now I have an interesting personal connection to this. We're talking about the Osho cult. Osho was essentially a New Age guru back during the 1970s and 80s, and he was initially based out of India, and all of his followers were going there, but they came and they moved out to the western United States and had a great big compound out there, and there was a lot of controversy because everything from, weird sex cult allegations, which were, essentially true, to allegations of murder get tied in with their operations. But my personal connection with the Osho cult. Okay, I knew a guy who lived right here in Asheville, North Carolina, who had been a former member, and he hosted a radio show on one of our talk radio stations in the cluster back when I produced radio. And I don't know to what extent or how long he had been involved, but he had actually told me that he had been a member at one point of the Osho cult. So a lot of people came and went over the years, and a lot of them appear in this documentary. He was somewhat famous for Osho, that is, riding around in a Rolls Royce. And, of course, more importantly, the controversies associated with the group and their activities as outlined in this new documentary series. So, no, ladies and gentlemen, fortunately, the cult itself came before my time, and I was not a member. In fact, as far as I know, I've never been a member of any cults, and I hope never to be.
No free haircuts for you.
Yeah.
I'm going to let the cult thing pass by. I don't think I'm cut out for it.
Well, there's something that I think it fascinates everybody about that. And I'll tell you who he reminds me a lot of is Charles Manson. In fact, something in the mannerisms, there was something in the way that he spoke, even though his message is peace and love. I mean, really, as we saw on the second episode of this podcast, a lot of Charles Manson's episode is, peace, love, nature, same sort of thing. But when you have a cult, it seems to always, not always, but often culminate in some sort of frightening activity, whether it's the imposition of ideals on people, disassociation of individuals from their family and loved ones, and sometimes even, the allegations of murder and attempts at it. And as we saw with Manson, of course, they actually carried out atrocious murders. So cults, any way you look at it, it's really frightening stuff. But this documentary is extremely well done. And again, it's called Wild, Wild Country. Definitely folks should check that out.
Here we are again with the weird synchronicity. I mean, you watched it last night. I watched it last night. I don't think we've hardly even talked that much this week because everybody's just been so busy. So, I mean, That's another one of those weird 7 ages, space-time, synchronicities thing that happens a lot with this.
Oh, there's James getting all metaphysical on us, Jason, doing his metaphysical space-time thing.
It certainly couldn't be that it's just the hot trending item on Netflix right now, and we all happen to use that as our main source of entertainment. But hey, call it what it is. This does happen to the 7H team quite a bit.
It does. Yeah. It really does. And speaking of space and time, that being my official department, we lost a true pioneer as it relates to our knowledge of space and time recently. That, of course, the late Sir Stephen Hawking. And some interesting things about Hawking, of course. I mean, I have my own personal recollections of, reading A Brief History of Time and being so fascinated by that. Truly a formative experience for me, because that, not the only book that he ever authored by any means, and not the only book of his that I've ever read, although, as he would often say, part of what he, like Carl Sagan and others, wanted to try and do was, in addition to write the heady science papers that were highly specialized for members of, the physics community, physicists and philosophers of science, mathematicians and the like, he also wanted to be able to write about these subjects in a popular way that reached people, and that in a what one might call a lowbrow kind of a manner, address these issues in an understandable and, frankly, a compelling way in popular nonfiction. So A Brief History of Time, of course, right now, guys, is just trending on Amazon. It's one of the top sellers. I count myself proudly among those who was able to read and digest and enjoy that book before Hawking passed from this world. Have you guys read A Brief History of Time by chance?
I actually have not. I was always more of a Carl Sagan kind of guy. But, what I did find interesting about it, and while I have plenty of knowledge about Stephen Hawking's career and his life, as interesting and often tragic as it is portrayed, I have a lot of respect for him and Sagan and even people like Neil deGrasse Tyson today who dared to take that step to take scientific discipline and write about it in a popular way. Sagan was criticized for it. Hawking was criticized for it. A lot of times I think the science community in that regard takes offense to it being, doled out as they look at it to the popular groupings of people who want to pick that book up and read it for themselves. But, I always found that Hawking had ability to kind of become a cultural icon, the same as Carl Sagan did, the same as we see Neil deGrasse Tyson doing today, kind of carrying on that legacy. Maybe not writing as in depth as maybe Sagan did and Hawking did, but I always found it interesting that as intelligent and well-worded as those guys were, they still dared to step into that popular spotlight, which they were often criticized for.
Yeah.
I did see his biopic a couple of years ago, which is actually a great movie if you haven't seen it. But one of the things that always impressed me about Stephen Hawking is just his ability to remain really on top of his game, despite all of his personal setbacks, the disease that he had that basically made his body non-functional, and he was still able to do all of these great things. And that in itself should be like a lesson for people to, not let life's roadblocks and challenges to hold you back.
Oh yeah. That's what's really so important about Hawking, I think, in terms of my personal development, is I could look at Hawking, and truly, if I was going through a bumpy time in my life and it was just kind of, not as enjoyable, more work going in than enjoyment or reaping the benefits of the work and the seeds I've sown, sometimes it's natural that we all feel a little downtrodden. And I could look at Stephen Hawking and think that naturally, and those close to him talked about this. I watched a lot of documentaries about him over the years. It did get to him. He was frustrated at times. He was, sometimes I'm sure he felt like he was somewhat out of control with the degradation of his communication abilities over the decades. But he did nonetheless maintain a degree of command. And again, he saw through a full life with remarkable achievements, unprecedented as far as almost anyone among his peers and contemporaries in the modern arena of physics. And for somebody to do that with the extreme physical handicaps that Hawking had, it is not only remarkable, but it is so inspiring. And that's what's so great about him to me on a personal note, apart from his discoveries and commentary on the nature of the universe. And again, he was by many considered to be the world's greatest living scientist and a bit of a rock star in his field despite those handicaps. That's just what's so incredible. And I've got to share just the brief anecdote. I talked about it on one of my other podcasts recently, and so you guys know about this, but the story about a grad student was driving him to dinner, and they say that from the back seat of the car, a single word comes from Hawking, no. And they have to stop in the middle of the road, and they're waiting for Hawking to be able to compose the sentence, because while they were taking him to dinner, he was the one who knew the way to the restaurant. And they had to wait on him to be able to give them the proper directions. And so he was always in command, even when he wasn't in a situation where he could physically actually control anything more than his vocoder or whatever the device was. But, I'd gone online trying to see if there was a speech synth or something like that you could use. I found one. It doesn't really quite get the Hawking voice down. I'm imagining things like that are going to become popular apps here in the coming weeks, guys.
Oh, I'm sure. Anytime like something like this happens, those things spring into popular culture. But, talking about that story, Micah, as inspirational as it is, as they're pulled over there on the side waiting for him to get the directions together. And, that can sometimes take 10 or 15 minutes for him to compose a thought through his system. It just makes you wonder, at the age that he lived to, even though, he was afflicted with these detrimental health issues his whole life, there's always that what if question, what if this didn't happen? What could he have accomplished if he had, full means to get everything in his mind out, into research and out into text and out into the educational field. Because, it did take him longer, and, you're trying to transcribe everything through the computer system and have assistants to help you with all that. If he was just set free upon the world with no physical restrictions, you always have to ask yourself that what if question. How much further could he have pushed his ideas and theories? How much more could he have given the public and the world of education through his knowledge if he was able to just get it out? And I can only imagine the frustration that he had to go through, because this is someone who's just constantly thinking on a higher level than probably any of us even consider. And it had to be frustrating to not be able to just say what you need to say or write what you need to write to be able to get it out there immediately.
Well, let me spin that back on you, Brother Jason of the Pen and the Trail. It's interesting because perhaps we could look at it another way. He was arguably one of the most intelligent students that came through Cambridge, even prior to the onset of his disability. And prior to his diagnosis of ALS, those who knew him said that we often knew we were dealing with someone far cleverer than we were. So there's no question about his innate intelligence, but I wonder almost if it could also be that the fact that he was so restricted and had so much time, therefore, to think. Again, we must acknowledge the frustration of being trapped in a body that's immovable, but having a mind that can span the cosmos. He said many times throughout his life during speaking engagements and whatnot that he had traveled space and time throughout his life in his mind, and that we're all time travelers. Perhaps some of his great insight came from the necessity for being able to occupy such a fertile mind, and having no ability to be wasting time or putting his efforts into other endeavors, because as intelligent as he is, he very well could have been, and in fact actually was, a celebrity scientist on par with Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and others. But had he been able to walk, had he been able to talk, had he been able to host events and give lectures more often and appear on television programs more often, I wonder if that might have diminished his ability to make lasting contributions, because more so than many of his peers who are celebrity scientists, Hawking, although he is a science educator like Sagan was and like Tyson is, and both of those men, of course, making actual contributions to science, having written papers, having made discoveries, but not quite on par, in my opinion, with Hawking. We see that Hawking, by virtue of his unique position and also certain issues that affected him in his health and his ability to function over the years, that unique position nonetheless made him such that he was both very visible to the world, but he was constantly achieving. Within 2 weeks leading up to his death, he completed a theory, and this according to CNBC, a theory outlining his prediction for the end of the world just 2 weeks before his own death, which is interesting because you can't help but think, had it been somewhat imminent that he saw the end coming himself, and that this had in part inspired one of his great final achievements. The world-famous physicist, the article reads, who died last Wednesday, age 76, was a co-author on a mathematical paper in which he sought to prove the so-called multiverse theory, according to a report by UK newspaper The Sunday Times. This theory imagines the existence of many separate universes other than our own. And the final work is titled A Smooth Exit from Eternal Inflation. It's being reviewed by a leading scientific journal right now, and in it he predicted how our universe would eventually fade to darkness as the stars run out of energy. So we wish a very smooth exit to Stephen Hawking with his innumerable achievements, and, of course, yes, that scientific physicist pizzazz that he maintained over the years despite those physical disabilities. Incredible guy.
So, fellas, I want to do an update on the Chinese space station story. It's been in the news a lot lately. The thing's supposed to re-enter, in some time within a week or so. But anyway, there's a story on IFL Science about the satellite, but it's mostly about this website called satview.org, where you can actually track the space station in real time. And I always like tracking things. It's really not a satellite. It's the Chinese space station Tiangong-1. And right now they've got the time to re-enter 9 days, 8 hours, 7 minutes, and 24 seconds. Now, I've been looking at this thing all morning, and it's kind of neat. It tracks it all around the globe and in relation to where you're located based on whatever your computer sends back to the SatView servers. So right now, the altitude is 217.58 kilometers, and it has not changed at least in the last hour.
And it's hovering right over your house too, right?
It is hovering. As a matter of fact, the track is actually going to go pretty close. Oh. It looks like it's going to go over your house in the next 30 minutes or so.
Great.
10 minutes. What's amazing is how fast this satellite or the space station orbits the Earth. It's orbited at least 3 times in an hour that I've been kind of sitting here keeping an eye on this thing. So, the concern with the space station reentry is they don't know exactly when, and they don't know exactly where or how much of it will actually impact the Earth. So there's the danger of just the material objects that are left over causing damage, and then there's the danger of the leftover rocket fuel, which I think is hydrazine. So I like to play the odds. I like to go with the odds on this. The Earth is basically 75% ocean. So I'd say it's 75% that the thing's probably going to fall in the ocean somewhere. What do you guys think about it?
Well, I would agree that it's more likely that it will crash land into the ocean, but you never know. There are instances where there are strange things. For instance, okay, here's something funny, and we would never normally talk about this subject on 7 Ages, but there was the famous Kecksburg incident back in the day where many had claimed that they believed that some sort of a UFO had crashed in Pennsylvania, but what it always sounded a lot like to me, based on the description, it sounded like some sort of a Russian reentry capsule. The description of that was very similar to one of the Soyuz capsules, and there's footage of one of the capsules reentering and then crashing that you can find online, and the thing is almost saucer-esque in shape, and at very least would be similar enough to the description of that acorn-like object that they described in that famous incident. So, there are cases where there have been things that have fallen to Earth and they have struck land, and there's been naturally a lot of concern about these kind of incidents. Although it's unlikely that, let's put it actually in terms of likelihoods. It is more likely that it will either crash into the ocean or that the majority of it presumably will burn up in the reentry process. But I'm still concerned, though, about some of the harmful chemicals that might be present on board the Chinese space station, and whether this dispersal through the atmosphere upon reentry or something like that could happen, and that could have an environmental effect later on down the road.
Yeah, certainly. And, with the Kecksburg or any kind of reentry type, any type of vehicle that's designed to be a reentry vehicle, most of the vehicle, unless something goes catastrophically wrong, is designed to survive reentry. So there's a greater likelihood of something like that, hitting the, actually making landfall or hitting the Earth or causing some damage. But think about the space shuttle Columbia that broke up on reentry.
Right. Most
of that landed in East Texas and partially in Louisiana, and it's basically the same issue. There, there's rocket fuel and all types of things on the thing, and it didn't really cause a whole lot of damage on the ground, and it mostly landed in rural areas. So the space station is not a reentry vehicle, so it's designed to mostly burn up on reentry. So I guess that's good in a way.
Yeah, well, it's good, but we always, anytime something's coming hurtling toward the Earth, you always have that concern. You think about things like Tunguska, and you remember the meteor that was captured over in Russia a few years ago that lit up the sky and blew out the glass and all that kind of thing. I don't think it would be anything on that scale, but anytime there's something that we know for sure that's falling from space back to Earth, it definitely warrants a little bit of concern, especially with the environmental impact, as we talked about with the rocket fuel. That could potentially be a bigger issue than the structure itself.
And back to the kind of the original story is the cool internet gadget and technology that we have. You can actually sit here in the comfort of your own home and track the satellite as it falls and kills you. So
at least it gives you a few minutes to react, hopefully.
Absolutely. And we'll hope, of course, that there are no injuries, let alone fatalities that emanate from that. But again, Jason, actually, I do want to come back to you really quickly on that because of the environmental concern. If there are chemicals, potentially hazardous, possibly even radioactive contaminants on board the Chinese space station during reentry, I mean, what kinds of environmental risks might we be looking at as it relates to something like that? And do you think it's even plausible that there could be any kind of a dispersal through the atmosphere, or that some of this material might make its way back to Earth and cause an actual ground level contamination, whether it be...
Well, I mean... Again, it depends on a lot of factors here that we have to look at. Is A, how much fuel is actually going to be on board upon reentry? Is any of that going to get burned up as it's coming back through the atmosphere? And then if it is able to stay basically held hermetically sealed within the tanks or whatever, wherever that lands, if it's making a water landing, is it going to be able to remain sealed, or is it going to leak out? How close to shore are we talking? How close to major currents are we talking? And then a lot of times, individual nations will have clauses and programs in effect so that if something like that were to reentry and land in their, national property, that there's a mitigation. Sometimes there's fines and things that could be given to the country of origin. In this case, China. They could be held liable to a certain degree because of environmental impact to different nations. So there's a lot of different things to consider there. But yeah, I mean, rocket fuel is pretty nasty stuff as far as the environment goes. It's not something you want in your water supply, that's for sure, or in the atmosphere. But again, we would have to look at all those potential factors for mitigation. And certainly a big concern, as always, with any type of fuel or contaminant liquid, we're concerned with water supplies mostly. And, something else that is dealing with the ocean and different species in the ocean that is vastly important to this particular episode of Seven Ages is worldwide fisheries and conservation. One thing that's often overlooked, I have found, and this is one area that I've done a lot of work in through my environmental science, focus in marine environmental science, and this is something that I have a lot of history with, is international fisheries, and specifically highly migratory species. So my area of expertise that I had taught in for 5 years was various species of shark, tuna, swordfish, and billfish. So in this particular episode, we'll be doing an interview with Chris Fischer of the OCEARCH research group. They're doing some fantastic work as it pertains to the tracking of sharks, various species, specifically the great white, but they also work with other species. But something else that I want to kind of lead up with talking about, national and international fisheries as it pertains to our interview today. Sharks have a long history. They're some of the most ancient creatures that are still in the ocean. They've been there for millions and millions of years. But over the last couple of decades, we've seen massive declines in shark numbers. And one of those reasons is the implementation of what's known as a pelagic longliner. So this is a particular style of fishing where these fishing vessels will pay out fishing lines up to 100 kilometers in length. And at intervals set along that main line, there's every couple of feet, there'll be another hook that's hanging down. And what they do is they sort of target the middle water column because that's where a highly migratory species swim. So they may be targeting sharks for various market goods, but also in that same water column, you have tuna, you have billfish, you have swordfish all swimming. So ultimately, when you have 100-kilometer long fishing line, it takes a long time to pay that out. It also takes a long time to come back and retrieve the fish off of that line. So what you get a lot of times is the fish are just stuck on the line and they'll be eaten by other sharks. It ends up being, a lot of ways, an inefficient way of fishing. And other things that we've seen is the Chinese market and Asian demand for shark fins. So over the years, we've seen hundreds of millions of sharks get killed specifically for their fins. And this is a extremely tragic and detrimental practice where they'll catch the shark, bring it on board, cut all the fins off of the shark. While the shark's still alive, they'll throw the carcass back into the water with no fins on the shark. It sinks to the bottom and dies. And this has, over the years, received a lot of attention. And the Chinese market, specifically out of Hong Kong, Shanghai, places like that, were what was driving these often illegal fisheries. And the good news is that as this has become an international issue, there's been tons and tons of outreach. There's been a lot of protests and various things against the practice of shark finning. As of 2018, we've seen an 80% reduction in shark finning. And in the culture of China and places all across Asia, we've seen a vast reduction in the amount of shark fins coming in just because of the media that it's received. In a way, we're kind of fighting a cultural war as well, because the shark fin soup would be used for things like anniversaries, weddings, special occasions. It was also used in cosmetics and natural medicine, all kind of things like this. So it provided a means for a lot of different industries, but luckily through conservation, through bringing this to international attention, we're now finally beginning to see vast reductions. And the work that Chris Fischer is doing with OCEARCH is showing how the great white and other shark species are beginning to rebound after years of this type of treatment. And, it's also important that people out there understand the role of sharks in the ocean. Now, they get a bad rap from movies like Jaws and, all these type of stereotypes that go along with the sharks. A lot of that's bad information, but the sharks themselves, they play a very key role in the ocean. People need to understand what that is. I mean, they balance the food chain. They prey on old, sick, weak fish populations, and they help keep those populations from getting too big so that they end up, disrupting the entire food chain. So the role of the shark in basically maintaining the health and the ecosystems of the ocean is paramount. So we need these sharks to be there. We need everything to be in balance so that it doesn't affect the fisheries that we depend on as consumers of fish to be able to enjoy these type of things and have that as a food source. So all of this tied together, we have, I think, an excellent episode here addressing all types of science, but specifically ocean conservation and basically a great story of the return of the great white shark.
Yeah, I'm really eager to get into it. So when we come back after this break, we're going to be featuring our interview with Chris Fischer of OCEARCH, talking about all the issues that Jason has very brilliantly outlined for us here and the role of conservation efforts as it relates to our oceans. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Tonight we have the pleasure of speaking with Chris Fischer of the OCEARCH organization, who has an extremely unique mission that they have embarked on that's adding an incredible amount of scientific knowledge to what we know about many species of sharks, specifically the great white shark. So Chris, thank you for joining us here tonight, and we're extremely excited about hearing what you're doing and about the projects. To just begin, could you just kind of give us a brief overview of what OCEARCH encompasses and what your guys' goals are?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I think the main reason that we really started OCEARCH and began working with large sharks was about a decade ago. We had been working on the water primarily in the Pacific, and we were helping scientists study things like mahi and large billfish. And what we began to see was the practical world of full-time watermen wasn't working together with the academic community to create the best data we could so we could manage the ocean toward abundance. And there was this real breakdown between the two communities, and because of that, we just didn't have data. And it became apparent that we were in the midst of a large shark we were down to about 10% of our large sharks. And while I was helping these scientists study these other fish, they kept saying, look, if we don't get this large shark situation fixed, there will be no fish. They are the apex predator. They are the balance keepers. And as the large sharks go, the whole system goes. Kind of like the wolf or the lion in the forest. And so I was like, wow, that's kind of surprising to me. What's the deal with the sharks? And they began to tell us things like, if you lose the sharks in the open ocean, the squid explode like locusts, and every night when they migrate to the surface, they wipe out the baby yellowfin tuna, the baby snappers, the baby billfish, the baby mahi, and then there's nothing to grow up for us to eat. And I was just kind of shocked. I wasn't really totally connected with how important the sharks were. We were mostly big game fishermen at the time, and we were helping the scientists who studied those things. And so I said to the researchers, I was like, what's the deal with the shark crisis? He said, yeah, we're down to 9% or 10% of our large sharks, primarily because of shark fin soup. We're losing about 250,000 a day, 100 million a year. And I said to him, well, let's just manage them back. Where are they mating? Where are they giving birth? How can we remove them from this problem and move them toward abundance? And where are they mating? Where are they giving birth? How do they migrate? So big, no, we've never been able to figure that out. And I had a come to Jesus moment there with my relationship with the ocean, feeling like, I love the ocean. Here I'm having all these amazing experiences on the ocean, and I realized my relationship with the ocean was out of balance. I thought I loved the ocean, and I thought I was doing a lot for the ocean, but any relationship that's going to be successful long-term requires balance. And so at that time, I committed my life to building an enterprise to travel the world and serve the science communities who study these large apex predators, to help them close the gap on their life history puzzles so that we could manage these big sharks toward abundance, which moves the system toward abundance, and then all of our great-grandkids get to eat fish sandwiches. And if we didn't solve the puzzle of these large sharks, it wasn't going to happen. And you can understand why a scientist and his intern are not going to solve the puzzle of a 4,000-pound, 17-foot white shark. You need some salty guys for that. And I knew those salty guys. I was one of them. So then it became about how can we bring the world-class practical, the full-time watermen, together with the full-time academics so we could solve these puzzles, because you can't change the future of the ocean on a fisherman's story. You need a peer-reviewed published paper. But the scientists don't know how to catch what they study. So it was about bringing everybody together on a common vision with a great-grandchildren first disposition.
I mean, that's a beyond noble mission, and I understand fully, where you're coming from. I have that same sort of connection with the sea myself, having spent a great deal of time out there in the Atlantic. But how do you begin to even put together something of this magnitude? I mean, when you first realized what needed to be done for preserving these large species of sharks, what were the first steps to establishing something on the scale that you see with OCEARCH?
Well, when we were doing our work before on large billfish, the way we began helping scientists was that I was making this show called Offshore Adventures with Captain Brett McBride on ESPN2 back in the day, where the only place to watch fishing and hunting was Saturday morning on Sunday morning on ESPN. And I joined the board of the Billfish Foundation while I was doing that, and I began to hear these reports on what the scientists thought the billfish were doing. And it didn't really add up to me. And so since we were making this TV show, Offshore Adventures, and we had the boats and everything going, I said to one of the scientists at the board meeting, I was like, hey, I'll tell you what, I got making these TV shows, I got the boat paid for, you don't have a boat, you don't have any money, and you don't really know how to catch what you study, so why don't you start coming out on the boats with us for free? I'll give you a bunk. And I really started to enjoy the idea of making business and doing good at the same time. And so that's when I learned about this shark problem I previously mentioned. And so I thought, well, maybe I can scale this up and kind of move from an ESPN Outdoors level to a National Geographic level, sell some television shows around it, take half the money and fund the research and fund the ship, and use the other half to make the TV show. So over the next 4 years, I sold about $20 million worth of TV, and I was able to take $10 million of it, fund the ship operation and the guys to catch the fish and move the ship around the world, and then took the other $10 million and made the TV show. So it was really the same model of kind of making business and doing good at the same time, but we were able to scale it up, because you're going to need a ship to catch a 4,000-pound white shark, right? Not a yacht or a game boat.
Yeah,
and we were able to make that transition and kind of take the same vision of making business and doing good, being a servant of the ocean, a servant of scientists, and just scale it up and amplify that by moving from kind of an ESPN Outdoors level to a National Geographic and History Channel level.
Now, when you talk about large sharks, we know obviously you're dealing with the great white, but what other species are you dealing with, or is it exclusively based off the research of the great white shark?
No, so the real capacity we've built is to be able to capture large things for the science community. So that could be the great white shark, large tiger sharks, and other large sharks. Anything that's over 400 or 500 pounds and 8 or 9 feet. When it gets to that level, the scientists have a difficult time handling them. And so that's where we come in, right? We try to give the ship to these science communities where they don't have capacity. They don't need us to help them catch a 6-foot shark that they can work up, in a Carolina skiff. They need us for these larger animals. So that's where we focus our attention, is primarily closing data gaps on these large apex predators in the ocean.
Now, the ship that you guys are using, that you're describing, if the listeners, I encourage you, please go look at this, because this is a very interesting and unique design. Chris, can you kind of give us some insight into the engineering behind the ship itself and maybe how it came to be?
Sure. Well, the ship is a retired Bering Sea Crabber. We're a really, really smart guy out of Seattle bought it, a guy named Frank Miles, and he put this lift on the ship that would allow it to pick up a 50-foot sport fisher. So when I first got the ship, it carried a 50-foot sport fisher on the deck, a 30-foot center console, a tender, and a Jeep. And we saw that lift, and we were wondering, can we build kind of a corral, for lack of a better term, around that lift? And instead of picking up a game boat and putting it on the deck, could we swing these giant animals in there, pick them up for a few minutes, let the scientists huddle around them to do a bunch of work real quick, and then lower them back in the water and let them go? And it's really all about that lift, and it's all about guys like Captain Brett McBride. And also, it is a Bering Sea Crabber, because those same holds that used to carry king crabs provide a tremendous amount of ballast. So we can put that lift over the starboard side of the ship and pump out our starboard king crab holds, flood our port side king crab holds, and we can pick up 75,000 pounds with 1 degree of lift.
Wow, that's impressive. Chris, you got to have a pretty good crew with you to be able to carry this kind of stuff out. I mean, you know what they say about, when you're hiring employees and you got your team together, you got to be able to trust them with your life. This sounds like it could be a potentially dangerous operation if you haven't got the right people working with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the crew, right? I mean, you're not, even if you have a ship like the OCEARCH, you're not going to be able to put a 4,000-pound white shark in it and let it go alive after doing 15 minutes of work on it without some amazing people. And my primary right-hand guy from the very beginning, going back all the way to the Offshore Adventures day, is a guy named Captain Brett McBride. He's the most gifted, creative waterman I've met anywhere in the world. It's one thing where you get people who fish out of the same region or spend a season there and they get really good. But I am constantly asking Brett to travel to a new area of the world and catch something that's never been caught before, figure out what's going on in the ocean, in the system, read the water, and pull it off. And he continues to be able to do that, whether we're in Australia or Africa or Chile, the Galapagos, or the East Coast of the United States. He is just truly really gifted waterman. And then he's led our team, and we've put this team together that's been pretty steady over the years, so everybody's doing the same thing. It's kind of like creating that method and then repeating that method and keeping all the players in the same roles. And then what happens is you drive out, because everyone has so much experience and they're doing their job. So we got Brandon Eyre, who's our ship manager, who now has tagged over 350 animals. He can tag a shark in like 90 seconds, right? When we first started, it was 9 minutes. And then, we've had various chief engineers over the years, a great mate now, DJ, who runs the deck of the ship so that everything's prepared for all the sharks that come through, and even all the way down to the chef, right? Same chef for a number of years, keeping everyone fed. One of the things we believe on the ship is, if people have a good bed to sleep in and 3 square a day, that's how you work from dawn to dark for 30 days in a row when you're looking for maybe 1 bite or 2 bites over that period. And so the ship is runs smooth, and that allows you to really grind on the water so you can kind of pull off what's never been pulled off before.
You keep those bellies filled, and you'll keep your crew happy, that's for sure, right? Nobody likes working on an empty stomach.
Good night. A good night of sleep and a full belly goes a long way. Those are the things you can control, right?
Oh, yeah.
You can't control the weather. You can't control the water temperature. You can't control the fish. So you take what you can control and you put that at a top-notch level, and then that prepares you to grind for the odd chance that you have to maybe only one shot at taking advantage of.
That's right, brother.
Chris, I got to say, man, when we watch these videos, it's when you do get a shark online and you get it up and it's lifted up out of the water, I can only liken it to like a race car pit crew. Everyone just descends onto the shark and begins doing various testing and collecting all kinds of different data. Give us some insight into what is the data that you guys are trying to collect, and how are you using it to build your research?
Yeah, first I would say, the emotional journey of capturing large sharks is a very interesting one. I think it's contrary to probably what most people think. The science that occurs is in the middle of kind of that process. So when a large white shark comes in, particularly, it's really different if it's a little 1,000 to 2,000 pound shark, right? We'll get control of that animal and we'll have it ready to go to the lift in 6 to 8 minutes. We don't even really catch the animals anymore. I would say we quickly train them. They learn they can't get away and they give up. It's more like teaching a dog how to heel than catching a fish. But these larger animals, when they come in, like a 4,000 pound animal, it feels different because you're looking at your blood brothers, you're standing next to you shoulder to shoulder, and you're like, okay, no mistakes, because the thing is so powerful that anything can happen. And so when you first, a shark picks up a bait, and we're in the contender, right, a little 27T, 34, and we're hand lining these animals. There's no rod and reel big enough, so it's all about hand lining and boat driving. And they'll pick up a bait, and then you're going after them initially with kind of overwhelming force. These animals have a condition called learned helplessness, which means if they quickly realize they cannot get away, then they choose to give up. So initially you go after them with overwhelming force. You don't allow the shark to dictate the terms of what's going on. You get in front of it, you put it in a lead, and they can't go in reverse, right? So if you're in front of it with a lot of pressure, it can't go right, it can't go left, it can't go down, and they will fall right into a lead, kind of like a dog on a leash. And so after you've dictated the terms of things and it understands its best course of action is just to follow along, you then can kind of relax and regroup, but you had this overwhelming force kind of disposition in the beginning. You slide it into the cradle where the science goes on that you're talking about, and once it comes up into the cradle, your emotional disposition really transitions to one of kind of like nurturing a baby or taking care of a child. You're like, okay, sorry we got to go through this, but we're going to do 15 research projects on you right now in about 15 minutes, and we're going to try to make that as smooth as possible. So the first thing that happens is we'll draw blood from the shark. When we draw that blood, it's for a number of different reasons. One of the things is to understand the stress level of the shark when it enters the cradle. That blood sample will immediately go into the lab, and they'll start spinning it so we understand the stress level of the animal. We'll also do hormone assays on that to understand if a female could be potentially pregnant, and a general health assessment can be gotten from the blood sample. While that is occurring, another scientist will be making an incision on the belly of the shark, and we will put an acoustic tag inside its belly and then suture it up. These acoustic tags last for 10 years. And you all have a series of receivers that are underwater in front of the whole eastern seaboard, especially down in the southeast. And if those animals happen to swim within 300 meters of a receiver, it'll ping in and it'll get the number off that tag, which will identify the shark. But that data is downloaded sometimes only once or twice a year, so you know what happens in the past. But the nice thing about it is it's this really long-term thing, and if you have a bunch of receivers on one beach and it happens to live there, you can see which part of the beach it prefers. Really a fine-scale, short, small area device. While that is occurring simultaneously, we have a scientist grabbing bacteria off of different parts of the shark. This bacteria we're using in drug discovery for humans because sharks have a rapid capacity to heal. And we're getting ready to attempt to patent our first several new antibiotics, which are showing great progress against some of the most serious infections we have, things like staph. And so we're hoping to be developing and harness this rapid healing process sharks have to help mankind. Additionally, people are grabbing parasites off different parts of the shark, and we send those to Auburn, and we have a global parasitology project going on which identifies different and new types of parasites, as well as parasites can help you understand where sharks live, because certain parasites only come from certain parts of the world. Once that first series of things is done, that's done while the animal's on its side. We'll then rotate the animal onto its belly. While it's on its belly, that's where we proceed to put on the spot tag that's on the top of its dorsal fin that everyone follows on the Global Shark Tracker at OCEARCH.org. And that allows us, every time the shark puts its fin out of the water for 5 years, to give us its location anywhere in the world. And that is what is really helping us solve these big life history puzzles, because it allows us to track them for such a long period of time. And it's allowed us to see the males have a 1-year migratory loop and the females a 2-year migratory loop, which we can talk about later. Additionally, during that time, we'll make an incision on its back and take a muscle biopsy, which we do an isotope study on to understand the animal's diet. We'll put a PSAT tag into the shark, which tracks its water temperature it's in and its dive profiles. And if it's a male, we'll try to get a sperm sample from the male to understand if it's reproductively ripe. Additionally, we'll be measuring the animal's length and girth. This is the first time these scientists have ever been able to stand next to these large animals and actually get accurate measurements. We'll get photographs of its eyes. We have a whole optics eyeball study going on these white sharks. So there's about 15 research projects we'll do in 15 minutes, which is powerful because we've been able to get all these scientists to collaborate, which is not the way science has been done in the past so much when it comes to large sharks.
Wow.
And then we will take another blood sample right before we let the animal go. And we do that because we can then compare the stress values of right before letting it go compared to the one right when it came in the cradle, and we can understand the impact of all of the procedures on the animal while it was in the cradle. We lower the white shark back into the water, and we let it go, and then I look around and make sure the shark's okay, and all the people have 10 fingers and 10 toes, and then you go into kind of this euphoric slide, which I call the white shark slide. It's kind of like relief, and the shark is fine. The samples and the science are priceless for the future and creating more fish for our children, and the shark is okay, and the people are okay, and then there's this big kind of relief, euphoric kind of slide. I call it the white shark slide.
That's one heck of a process, guys.
Yeah, man, that's amazing. What is the normal or the kind of the typical range for the male and the female great white shark? I know you said there's a year migratory route or a 2-year migratory route, but what's that equate to in area, I guess, square miles or whatever?
Yeah. So we're seeing it's pretty typical for a mature female to be migrating 15 to 20,000 miles a year. The life of the male white shark is much simpler than that of the female. The male white shark has a 1-year migratory loop because it can mate every year. The females only go to the mating site on average every other year because they have an 18-month gestation period. So they have a big 2-year loop because they got to go gestate, grow their babies, and then go to a birthing site, recover, and go back and mate. And these animals aren't sexually mature until they're 20.
Speaking of the age of these sharks and looking at, again, a human being reaches sexual maturity well before that age. I mean, what's the average age of a great white? How long do these species typically live, Chris?
Well, I mean, we know they live to be well over 70. Yeah. I think it's significantly older. I think that for the most part, we're vastly underestimating the length of lives of most of the fish in the ocean. I think there's multiple reasons for that. I think it's kind of, as a fisherman and someone who loves to fish, I think it's kind of emotionally convenient to feel like something doesn't live that long and it reproduces early in life, especially if you're harvesting. But I think we're miscalculating dramatically. Most things live much, much longer than we think. And I think these animals live to be much, much older than 70.
Now, Chris, bouncing back for just a second to that long distance migratory path that we're talking about. I know that, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the great white is still currently considered to be vulnerable as far as protection goes. Their numbers were down significantly just a decade or so ago, and they seem to have been trending up. But, here in the United States and our fisheries waters, we have federal fishing regulations that protect certain species and have catch quotas and size limits and all that type of thing. So when these sharks are moving out of the protection of those federal fisheries laws, what is the major impact that's decreasing their numbers in other parts of the world? Is it fisheries? Is it things like pelagic longliners? Is it pollution? What seems to be affecting these apex predators the most as far as lowering the numbers of overall species?
Yeah, so first I'd like to say, in the United States, we're winning. Under the current level of pressure that we have, both commercially and recreationally, we're trending up. So we're winning here. And I don't see a lot of big changes that need to occur in the United States, just kind of from an anecdotal standpoint. The big threat is illegal finning operations and the finning mafias around the world, right? These are operations that work in the high seas and in areas where there's no enforcement, where they capture the sharks, cut their fins off, and then dump the bodies because they only want to carry fins because they get more money per, and they don't want to fill their boat up with shark bodies. So they just fin them. So it's primarily illegal finning operations that are big long-lining operations from foreign fleets.
Yeah, I followed the fishing, the finning, and all of that for years, and I'm well aware of the impact that it has on the sharks and various species of the sea. And it really is a terrible tragedy, and I can only hope that continues to get exposure so that those people can be sorted out. Something else that
the great thing about this is we're going to win. Like, demand in China is plummeting. It's off about 50%. The Chinese government's no longer serving it. 95% of the fins go through Hong Kong into China. The government's no longer serving it at state functions. A lot of the airlines won't carry it. A lot of the big fancy hotels are no longer serving it. We are going to win this one. But it's always a bummer when you tag a beautiful mako shark or blue shark somewhere off the east coast of the United States that swims in the east coast, swims off into international waters, and then you see the tag come up out of the water and go straight to Portugal or straight to Spain or straight to West Africa. And then, it's been finned and it's on the deck and it's just, going straight to a port for an illegal finning operation. We see it all the time. I never understood when we started this, we were just trying to solve this puzzle to make sure our kids could eat fish. I really didn't understand the value that was going to be created in the mortality study of seeing where sharks were caught, killed, finned, and what ports the finners were operating out of. But we've been able to see that now across Portugal, West Africa, as well as Mozambique.
Wow. So in a way, you're not only helping with conservation, but you're helping with law enforcement as far as tracking where these fins are moving and who may be in charge of the illegal fishing operations. Have you had any affirmation of that from law enforcement as far as being able to help with that mission?
So what we've been able to do is the ocean is such a vast place, you can't enforce everywhere. But by seeing where the animals are taken and harvested, we've been able to focus enforcement where the problem is versus trying to enforce the whole ocean.
Right. And well, at a minimum, at least you're gathering that pertinent information so that you can at least know where to focus your efforts in the future. So
yeah, and we've also had some hard results on that. Like we were tagging some sharks in the Galapagos, and one of the sharks, which wasn't supposed to be, was caught and killed and taken to the dock there, and then they shut down temporary longlining within the Galapagos National Park, which is a World Heritage Site. So we've been working in Panama, and then worked with President Martinelli, got the foreign fleet thrown out of the country, so the local fishermen could catch fish for the people, and foreign fleets couldn't come in and steal the resource. So it's translated into real on the ground type issues.
Chris, just a general question about white sharks here. The great white sharks off the United States, and then there's the South African sharks, and then the sharks off of Australia. If there's any difference between these different groups of sharks as far as behavior goes, or how they migrate? Well,
their behavior is very, very different. And I've actually never talked about this publicly, but it's pertinent since you're on the East Coast. We see a tremendous difference in the behavior of sharks that live in areas where there's cage diving versus areas where there is not. A truly wild white shark like we have here on the East Coast of the United States is the most nervous animal you've ever dealt with in your life. When we see an animal coming into the ship in the East Coast of the U.S. where there's no cage diving on it, we may see it 200 or 300 yards away, and from that moment, we'll be on that little contender, and no one will even take a step on the deck, because it feels like if you take a step on the deck, they're gone. They are so nervous that they don't want to approach any sort of foreign vessel. They don't, what's that crazy noise of that boat? That doesn't sound right. I'm out of here. kind of like a lion in the forest. You know, it runs away before you knew it was there because they're more nervous than you are. When you deal with animals where there's cage diving, when you drop the anchor, they show up behind the boat because they're trained that's the sound of food. Kind of like a goldfish coming up to the top of the tank when you feed it, or feeding the tarpon under the dock, and it's always there. So we see radical differences in the behavior of the animals when it comes to capturing them when you work in areas where there is cage diving and where there is not.
We've got to ask, though, of course, now, what does this have to do with so much in terms of that environment? Are the animals unfamiliar with the presence of a boat, or is it that in these kinds of situations where there isn't cage diving and they haven't been acclimated to that kind of environment, is this a foreign kind of a capacity in their environment that they react to, or is it the fact that they are learning things over time?
It's just conditioning. It's just like the tarpon under the dock, right? It never leaves, and it's not afraid of you. You go to a grouper that is not used to that, and you jump in the water, boom, it's gone, right? Mm-hmm. It's nervous. It's what makes solving the life history puzzle on the East Coast such a spectacular challenge, right? Mm-hmm. In places like Africa, we rode down there, we caught and tagged and worked up 40 white sharks in about 22 days of fishing. On the East Coast of the United States, we've put in probably 200 days of fishing, and maybe more. And we've been able to capture 32, I think. So it is a much different challenge, right? It gets so interesting, you know, in some of these places where there's cage diving, where they're always throwing out like a carcass tied onto a lobster buoy, maybe a red buoy. That when we're working in places where there's cage diving, we can't even get the sharks to switch off the red buoy onto a bait, and we put the buoy on the hook. And they eat the buoy instead of the bait.
Wow.
That's how trained they are.
That's incredible. That's just incredible.
Yeah, it truly is.
Yeah.
And another development that I noticed on your website is these STEM programs that you have, these science, technology, engineering, and mathematics programs. If you speak to that a little bit, who is using them? How are they being distributed? And how did you begin to develop that sort of curriculum?
So what happened with that is in 2012, we decided to open source all of OCEARCH. So we left television and we open source all of our expeditions in real time, all our content in real time, and then the tracking in real time. Look, if you're going to create a global ocean movement, it's going to take us all. And if it's going to take us all and you believe that, you got to create a vehicle for everyone to be involved. So I was like, everyone needs to see this tracking, not just the scientists. And so we created the Global Shark Tracker. And, who piled in, right? The kids, sharks and dinosaurs. So the kids start tracking all the sharks. And I speak at a lot of schools. And so I was in a third grade class in Jacksonville, 8 years ago. And this teacher had taken the Global Shark Tracker, and she had full-size replicas of the sharks, and the kids were learning how to measure. And they were tracking the sharks on a map, and they were learning geography and doing math problems on how fast the shark was moving. And she said to me, she was like, look, I can't get these kids interested in science and math, but they love to track the sharks. So I just leveraged the sharks to teach them science and math. And I was like, wow, can I bum that idea and try to scale it? She said yes. And so I was able to go to Landry's in Houston, which I think many people know, and I was able to get them to fund a K through 12 STEM-based educational curriculum, science, technology, engineering, and math. It was integrated into the real-time tracking of the sharks. So the kids could do the math problem. Look, it's way cooler to see, like, how fast did Mary Lee swim from Charleston to Jacksonville against a 2-knot current in 2 days to get there. Then Bob got on the train in Philly, and Bob got off the train in New York. How fast did the train go? So it was education in the now, science in the now, exploration in the now, education in the now. All these kids are in the now. And Landry's came through with, now we have well over 100, I think around 150 K through 12 lesson plans that is open sourced and free at OCEARCH.org under the education tab. And while students track sharks in real time and they see us solving a puzzle that's fundamentally important to the future abundance of the planet, they can apply real-time STEM curriculum issues to that real-time science project and learn the fundamental skills they need to get a job. And then also, it teaches them about science, and it teaches them about resource management. And look, I'm a data-driven centrist. I am not some fringy environmentalist, right? I'm about chasing the science, create the data, manage from the middle, be solution-oriented, create practical progress. And so I wanted to also leverage it to create the resource manager of the future. I do not want an emotionally based resource manager of the future. I want a science-based, data-based centrist to be the resource manager of the future who is solution-oriented. So the educational curriculum not only teaches them the skills they need to get a good job, but it shows them this disposition of pursuing science and data to manage toward abundance rather than pursuing an emotional disposition for some feel-good thing that could accidentally undermine the abundance of the future.
Chris, I think you're a man after our own hearts. And I have to tell you, I'm still that kid that loves dinosaurs and sharks. So I went on your website and played with that tracker, and I think it's super cool. So, and I think you guys are doing a great work. And what you just said about it's basically practical science. I'm a geologist. I'm a working scientist. So I apply scientific principles to everyday type situations where we have to solve problems or have ongoing solutions that are sustainable. So, and that's what it's really, really all about. Now, I got to shift gears just a little bit, though. We're based here in the Southeast, and I know you guys just wrapped up your low country expedition. I think it wrapped up in January. What interesting things did you learn during that expedition?
Well, that expedition was brutal. You know, it was right after that bomb cyclone storm that rolled through in late December, early January. And the water temperature was 47 degrees, and it should have been probably, you know, somewhere between 57 and 62. And what I learned on that expedition, quite frankly, is when I saw that water temperature, I should either move the ship to a different region of the world or just postpone the expedition until the water temperature came back up, because I have never been on the water. 31 expeditions around the world. We never saw one animal in 25 days of grinding at sea because the water temperature was between 47 and 52. It was brutal. It was brutally cold, and it was a good learning for us. It was a really interesting thing to mature as someone who's led 31 expeditions, that if I would have had the courage to tell everyone to go home for a month and we have to come back, we probably would have tagged a half a dozen sharks. But instead I was like, oh, we'll grind that out and find a way, because we had the previous 30 expeditions. And what we do know is happening down here in the southeastern United States is these sharks are overwintering down here. They are balancing your ocean from, you know, late December through April. When you have a drum run down the beach, the white sharks are on that drum run. I mean, they're 80-pound gumdrops. They're culling the weak, the dead, and the dying so that the strong pass their genes and your fish stocks get stronger. When you have a big bait run, they're on that bait run, even if it's up a river, even if it's up a bay. As long as it's salty enough, they're on it, culling the weak, the dead, and the dying so that the fish stocks get stronger. When you have a red drum run and they're all these big bull red drum are piled up on the end of all these jetties at your rivers, the white sharks are on that, and they're culling the weak, the dead, and the dying. And so it's really interesting and also important for all of your listeners to understand that you live in a very special place, and that if you keep the management right here and you look after the resource, and the white sharks are balancing your system and they're here because it's abundant, you will ensure basically the abundance and health of the entire eastern seaboard, because the balance keepers are here for about a third of the year. And if they are thriving here and they can thrive across the rest of the system, our kids are going to eat fish.
I do have something that I noticed on the videos that I found very endearing, and I want to kind of get your thoughts on this. Kind of a two-part question. The naming of the sharks. So, you know, I saw Lydia and Catherine, Betsy and Mary Lee. So the first part of the question is there any type of sponsorship for people who would maybe want to sponsor one of those sharks to help, you know, build money for your research? And the second part of the question seemed to be a very special naming for you. So tell us about the shark named George.
You know, the naming of the sharks is, you know, something for the most part we try to give away to the communities in which we operate in front of, because I want to make every community feel like that the shark is theirs. right? So 95% of the sharks are named after the communities in which we operate in front of, or the people who fund our work. Like, I think that conscious capitalism is going to be the way I believe we have an abundant future. Like, buy from companies who are making business and doing good. And our ship is funded by Costa Sunglasses, Yeti Coolers, Southern Tide Apparel, SeaWorld, and we have Shark Tracker Light Lager and Beer. So we can do all this work and give the ship to the scientists and open source all the data. And that's because we live in this era of connectivity and open sourcing. And so most of the work is like, man, if you like what OCEARCH is doing, consume from those companies that are making business and doing good. They get it, right? If the ocean's not full of fish, no one's going to need their product in the future 50 years from now. But every once in a while, we name a shark for people who've helped us along the way. And, Mary Lee is named after my mom. Mary Lee, the reason I named that shark Mary Lee is because it was 2012 and we had just not gotten renewed from the History Channel. And I thought I was going to lose the ship and lose my house. And I thought it was the last shark we were ever going to touch. And to honor my mother, I named it after my mom. And that was in 2012. And after that, Caterpillar came in and funded our operation for 3 years, along with Costa and Yeti, and kept us alive. And we've been able to evolve from there and grow. But that shark was named after my mom because I thought it was over. And then Mary Lee turned out to light up the whole eastern seaboard and really plug people into our work and create so much radical scale. It's why companies like Caterpillar jumped in, and Costa and Yeti had been there from the beginning. They've been helping us for over a decade. So that was, a really emotional experience. And then Mary Lee, thinking it was over, and then lo and behold, she travels down the East Coast and creates so much attention, she actually ends up saving OCEARCH. And then George, my father, has done so much, right? He's 85 years old. He's still we get my monthly financials and he mentors me. He is full speed, badass entrepreneur, right? I grew up in a household with a super entrepreneurial father, and then on the weekends we served Meals on Wheels with my mother. So we had this kind of entrepreneurial kind of vibe, and we had this service or give back vibe. And I think when you look at OCEARCH, I'm trying to collide those two worlds and make a global impact. And so when we caught the first mature male ever in Northwest Atlantic history, I wanted to honor my father. And so I named that shark George after my father, because I knew that the data set that was going to come from that shark, these animals are sexually segregated. They don't live together. They only come together when they mate. And we had never caught a mature male, but we had a number of mature females. And I knew that the migratory path of George was going to show us where he collided with females. And for the first time ever, it was going to show us where they were mating. And so we were going to be able to prove the mating site. And then we know they have an 18-month gestation period. So we were going to be able to track the females 18 months from there and find the birthing site, and then go catch the babies and identify the nursery, which is the real key to saving the species, right? Looking after the babies. So George was so fundamentally important. And my father, I talked to him yesterday. He was hammering me on our February financials, It's been so amazing that I wanted to take that moment and honor him. No one can understand. I shouldn't say that. Probably many people can understand, but I have had a glorious journey as the youngest of 5 with amazing siblings and 2 parents that have provided a platform to leap from, and the support emotionally, and to feel like you could conquer anything and try to make a global impact. And I was just trying to honor my parents, and I felt a tad bit selfish about it. I got to be honest with you, because that's not what we normally do. But it's taken everything, man. It has taken everything, and I would not have pulled it off without my parents.
Chris, that is, if there is such a thing as a noble selfishness, you have exemplified that. And, we just want to commend you here on 7 Ages for all the work that you do, for bringing family into it, for the research, and frankly, for the adventure. What you do and the way that you bring this to a popular audience through talking with guys like my comrades and I, it really instills adventure and an interest in the sciences in the hearts of those who hear what you do. Thank you for joining us. And tell us again, if people want to learn more about what you do and your organization, how can they find you online and learn about your operations?
Yeah, we'll go to OCEARCH.org, and there you can track the sharks on your laptop or download the free apps for the Droid and the iPhone. It's the Global Shark Tracker. Track the sharks in real time, and then, follow all the social handles. If you go to the OCEARCH YouTube channel, you can watch all the little short films about tagging sharks, the Instagram, the Twitter, the Facebook handles. You can be on the water with us in real time. And make sure your science teachers at all your schools know about the free educational curriculum so we get them tuned in to what's going on in the sharks and they can be the resource managers we need in the future.
That's right. And keep in mind, folks at home, it's OCEARCH, O-C, not O-S, O-C-E-A-R-C-H. You can Google that and find out. And we hope that some of the educators in our audience will reach out to Chris and others, find out what they're doing, follow along. Remember, it's interactive. And Chris, again, thank you so much for being a part of this program.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm grateful. And anything's possible if you don't care who gets the credit. So be a part of it. Stop using plastics, man. No more single-use bottles. No more straws. It's going to take us all. So we're all going to have to make little moves in our lives. And we will be proud of the planet. We will win this one. We have no choice. And it's going to take us all, right? It's going to take us all if we're going to be proud of the planet we leave our kids.
Well, we want to thank Chris Fischer for his time. That was an enlightening interview. I learned an incredible amount. This is an area that I've worked in for many years, but what they're doing is unique. They have a very interesting approach, and I commend them for doing what they're doing. They're getting tons of scientific information out there that we never had before. What do you guys think about the way they're setting that thing up and doing it? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I'll just say it is impressive. And again, Chris taking time to talk about that with us is really interesting. Also, fun fact, not related to Chris, this is a fun fact, a behind-the-scenes bit of info about our co-host Jason Pentrail. His nickname around the Seven Ages Cross-Time Pub is Jaws because of his interest in sharks. And this guy, when we get out and we work the creeks down there around the ancient Oligocene deposits outside of Charleston, South Carolina, and we'll be looking for fossils and things like that. In fact, I found my first megalodon shark tooth with Jason Pentrail in a creek under his supervision and steering. He is a true expert on all this. He knows and can identify every ancient extinct shark species. We'll pull up stuff that, would look like a twig or maybe a piece of fossilized wood, and he'll be like, that's an ancient horse tooth. This tooth belonged to a barracuda. That right there is the inner bone of the ear of a whale. Here's where we actually found a whale in situ in this bank where they were able to remove this thing, and the University of Charleston now has that on display. So in addition to conservation efforts, paleontological interests are definitely something that I've got to toot Jason's horn for him about, because he's contributed a lot of discoveries and finds that have helped the education system down there in Charleston, South Carolina. And as licensed hobby divers in the state of South Carolina, all three of the hosts of the Seven Ages Audio Journal here, we actually have to report to the state of the state of South Carolina, any paleontological discoveries that we find. So we're not just out there digging for fossils and artifacts and things. That's kind of stuff that you hear us talking about on this show is in an effort to catalog data about these kinds of discoveries and report things back to the educational system. And in fact, we're licensed to do so in that state. So that's part of what we're trying to do. And old Jaws here does a really good job helping us out there in the field. So thanks, Jason.
My pleasure, fellas.
Yeah. I know we enjoy Guinness. There's an incredible affinity that we all have for Guinness here as we're kind of wrapping things up here in the Cross-Time Pub. But recently I tried a unique American whiskey, which is called Tin Cup. Either of you ever had Tin Cup?
No, but you now have my attention.
Well, I mean, we had enjoyed during recent archaeological field excavation week, which we'll talk about in a future edition of the podcast, but we had enjoyed something coinciding with St. Paddy's Day, which was the Jameson Stout Edition, which is the Caskmates line that they're doing, where they're actually aging some of their spirits in beer casks They've got a stout and an IPA edition, and so James treated us to a bottle of the stout edition down there, and we enjoyed that. Coming home, I guess, with the Kentucky Derby looming ever nearer, I had bourbon on my mind. Now, Tin Cup, despite the name, which makes it sound an awful lot like a Derby-associated kind of bourbon, it's not actually a bourbon. In fact, what it is it is a blend of a non-Kentucky bourbon, which you might call an American whiskey. They blend that with a American Scotch-style whiskey, a single malt, and then they actually infuse that with spring water, and it ends up tasting like, well, actually just like a bourbon. It's a really smooth bourbon nonetheless, but I bought it because I was very interested in the combination of ingredients and the infusion of the spring water, as well as the locations of the distillations for the whiskey types that were blended for this beverage. But so not really a bourbon, despite the name, which sounds an awful lot like the Kentucky Derby or something associated with it. But have either of you guys been to the Derby before?
No, never been.
I've actually never been to Kentucky at all, but I've always wanted to go. I mean, there's a ton of archaeological stuff up there, and it just looks like a beautiful state. So it's been on my list for quite a while. Yeah,
our good friend Tiffany Mack and I, we have plans supposedly to go to Mammoth Cave together at some point, but I keep trying to get her to invite me up there to go to the Derby. I guess I'd have to get a bowler hat for that, though, right? Or maybe I could wear my Homburg.
The Homburg would be more than appropriate, I think. It's all about the fashion and the style. I mean, that's half the fun of going to the Derby. It's more about the fashion and the drinks than it is the race, I believe.
That's right. So although it's not really a Kentucky bourbon, Tin Cup nonetheless wins the race this week for the 7 Ages Audio Journal. And on behalf of my comrades and I'm Micah Hanks, and I want to thank you both once again for a fantastic show as we gather together here around the table at the Cross Time Pub. Be sure to follow us online. We have a YouTube channel as well as Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And, of course, all of that information can be found at 7ages.org. I am Micah, he is Jason, and he is James. We are the 7 Ages Research Associates, and we will catch you next time on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.